This is Emily Hutter Kennedy's numbers. This was her PhD. Her sample size was in Washington State. She's at UBC and she's Canadian. But she then cross-tabulated it with a national survey, so she's fairly confident about these numbers. And people who are eco-engaged, that's the majority of us, they're about 30% of the population. People who are self-effacing, they're between 15 and 20. And you can see the breakdowns for the other. And when we're communicating with people, there's no point in trying to ask people to leave their group in the kind of action that they take. It has to make sense to their own identity. And that's, my friend Louise Comeau, who's probably the country's expert on what Canadians think about Canadian climate change. That's what she says. It's all about identity. So don't start by asking people to switch their identity. You're going to lose them right away. Now here's another way of thinking about how we think differently, about how we don't have to all care about the environment in the same way. This is from Yale. Yale has a communications research lab, which is the best in the US. And they do huge amounts of polling, and they have a newsletter every week at least, and lots of interesting material. And this is their quite well-known 6 Americas breakdown. So you can see the numbers are not that different. The breakdown's a bit different than Emily's, but the numbers are not that different, right? So we're trying for broad swaths. The numbers go up and down depending on how bad the affordability crisis is, depending on who's in government. But generally speaking, these are pretty constant. So a lot of communication strategy to this point has been to go after the alarmed and the concerned, because together they make up a majority, right? So, but what we're starting to find now with the advent of the success of very small, very angry groups in social media land and elsewhere, is that we actually have to go after broader audiences now, because we have to begin to diffuse the toxicity of their messaging if we're not going to lose people in the concerned group. So some of the work that we're doing is trying to figure out how to reach them. And an example of that is, some of you may be following the US election campaign. The Democrats have started a social media feed called Republicans for Kamala Harris. And those ads are all aimed at the angry group in the middle, or at the end, right? So, because people like me are voting for Kamala, so maybe it's okay for me to vote or to stay home. All right, so that's one way of thinking about it. Another, okay, so now we're gonna test our first video. And this is John Marshall, who will tell you his story, but we're just gonna make sure the tech is lined up. People on Zoom, please let us know when you can hear it.
I often have this strange thought that to Earth to check us out. They beam up 100 scientists and they ask them, what's going on your planet? And the aliens quickly learn something, that all of these scientists have concluded that I often have this strange thought that aliens come down to Earth to check us out. They beam up 100 scientists and they ask them, what's going on your planet? And the aliens quickly learn something, that all of these scientists have concluded that pollution from our industrial activity is irreversibly heating the Earth in a way that'll make it very hard for us to live here safely. Then they do the same thing, but this time they beam up another 100 people, and they're not scientists, they're regular people like us. They could count on one hand how many of those people would even mention climate change. 2 or 3 dozen of them may never have even heard the term. And among the Americans in the group, only 1 in 4 would be highly concerned about the issue. The aliens, I think, would be shocked. Why don't people know what's happening or how bad it is? Someone should tell them. The absurdity of this situation is so clear and so real. What we have here is a failure to communicate. My job is to educate people about climate change. So I look at the concepts, the messages, the images, and the terms, and I test them with millions of people. I'd like to tell you what I'm learning. For so many people, climate change seems abstract, distant, too big to imagine. The words we often use to describe it, emissions, CO2, methane, net zero, anthropogenic, are simply put confusing. Not that many people wake up in the morning and say, it's a great day for some decarbonization. These words become obstacles rather than gateways to understanding, let alone caring. The way to fix this failure to communicate is to start not by talking about the issue, but to start with people. To think first about individuals, the people who have millions of other things on their mind, a million worries and challenges and hopes and aspirations. Climate change is one of the biggest threats humanity has ever faced. And we won't face it, not to the degree that's necessary, if people don't care. The people-first approach to climate communications demands three simple things. The first one is plain, obvious, and universal language. One thing for sure, people don't readily get: carbon emissions, net zero, or most terms that can be found in a science book. And frankly, to the uninitiated, much of it doesn't really sound that bad. 2 degrees warmer in 50 years? Or it sounds so bad that you can't even get your head around it. 1.2 trillion tons of ice? Confusion and hopelessness are the enemies of understanding. A good test for language is what pops into your head when you hear it. If you hear a term like climate change, what pops into your head? Well, for most people, the answer is not much. The language isn't vivid. What we need is vivid language that everyone gets. It's remarkable how many people actually confuse climate change with the ozone hole. More than 4 in 10 Americans think the ozone hole actually causes global warming, and so many of them remember and understand so much about ozone depletion. Why is that? Because it's a hole, it's a layer. People can see it, imagine it, relate to it. It uses simple metaphor that's an instant get. Here's a little story that gets a similar aha for climate change. Humans have been on Earth for about 300,000 years. But we've only started polluting like this in about the last 60. Our pollution stays in the air for thousands of years, creating a thickening blanket that traps heat in the atmosphere. That heat causes stronger hurricanes, bigger fires, more frequent floods, and the extinction of thousands of species. But there's good news. To stop the pollution blanket, we just have to stop polluting. This pollution blanket framing is one of the most effective we've tested at getting people to understand the issue. It's visual, it's vivid, and when people hear the message, they become significantly more engaged. They get it. There are so many other regular speak words and concepts that stick with people. Instead of warming, try overheating. Instead of climate, talk about extreme weather. When mentioning clean energy, you might say cheap energy as well, as it's rapidly becoming cheap. The word irreversible really gets people's attention, as the pollution certainly is. And if you absolutely must talk about temperature increases and you live in the US, heck, use Fahrenheit for goodness sake. It doubles the severity. 9 degrees during your kid's lifetime sounds pretty serious. 1.5 degrees Celsius to meet the Paris Accord is pretty ignorable. This is about going beyond arcane policy language into language that we all intuitively get. That's the first step, understanding. But understanding without relevance is rudderless. So the second key then is to make climate feel like something that matters to you, to your life, individually and personally. Nobody has an epiphany about policy proposals. Awakenings are personal. They have local relevance. They're about your life and your concerns. As an example, we presented 2 messages to a few thousand people in Florida. One asked them to demand that we get to zero emissions to stop climate change. Another simply said, stop my flooding. The latter message was over 4 times more effective in getting their attention. Local flooding was so much more relevant than global warming. What's needed isn't better policy descriptions, but rather deeper, more personal connections. Here's another example. We work with a team of remarkable women climate scientists to help elevate their voice as messengers. They've dedicated their careers to studying the issue, developing complex computational models to understand the Arctic processes, and climbing into planes to measure nitrogen in wildfire smoke. They could tell you everything you need to know about the science, but what we asked them about was why they study it. And they told us about their daughters and their sons, about wanting to keep the world safe and healthy and vibrant for their children. And when we shared these personal stories with other parents, they started to care far more deeply about climate change than they did from staring at charts of global temperatures. People see a parent who's dedicated their life to creating a better world for their child. Every parent can relate to that. It matters to me. The right messages are those that connect climate change to personal identity. Our life, not future lives. Not the world, our community, not necessarily environmentalism, our values, and not just children, our child. Finally, the third key to the climate communications puzzle, to show that climate change is an issue for people like me. Humans are social animals, and that's true for how we form our beliefs too. You can present the exact same message to many people, but when it comes from someone with a similar accent or background, we see double-digit increases in message effectiveness. Here's an unexpected messenger who really lands the point, a guy we call Florida Man. He's a resident of North Florida who got into a little trouble with the law after taking an alligator into a convenience store when he was on a beer run. Not exactly the most obvious climate change messenger. Yet when he appeared in an internet ad describing in his own way how he's worried about his way of life, it significantly increased climate concern among young conservative men in Florida. Most people don't see themselves as environmentalists per se, and they see climate change as an environmentalist issue. But messages that break away from those narrow identity markers make the issue relatable. They give people a reason to care. So the core idea is that instead of explaining the issue at people, it's essentially to bring people into the issue so that they say, I get it. It matters to me. It matters to people like me. Then and only then are we primed to take action. If the intelligent aliens in my story were also intelligent at communications, they would say to us, hey, Earthlings, pay attention. You're building up a massive blanket of pollution that's overheating your home, and it's going to hurt the people and the things that you love. You did this, and you can fix it. We simply have to let our fellow 8 billion inhabitants of our home know what's happening. We have no choice. And when we do, we'll achieve the public will necessary to take on this colossal but winnable fight for our future. Thank you.
All right, awesome. Next slide. There we go. So what he didn't tell you, I'll tell you now. I thought it was in that video, but John Marshall is a very well-known marketing expert. He works for he was a consulting expert with Lippincott, which is a big firm in Europe, and with lots of others too. And his son came home from university one day and said, Dad, I'm locking the apartment door and I'm not letting you out. You're selling, you're wasting your life selling soap and shampoo, and we have a planet to save. Go apply your talents to that. And John thought, you know what, he's actually right. And he got on the phone and he formed this Potential Energy Coalition, which is a not-for-profit, which is in the business of figuring out what the best messages are to sell action on climate change. They're not selling soap, they're selling getting active in climate change. So that's a bit about his story. So what did he say? He said, talk like a human. If you go to their website, there's a whole sheet about that, terms to use, terms to avoid. And here are some examples. The pollution blanket will hurt the places and people you love. Stop the flooding. You'll have seen in your social media feeds, if you're keyed in, things like Stop Canada Burning. That's lessons taken from Potential Energy Coalition. And Keep the Lights On is one of my favorites that ran in Ireland when they were worried about data centers taking up all the energy in a community in one of the places in Ireland that I love. All right, so that's John Marshall. That's an example of a wine taste, you know, that's it. They have a website, they break it down by country. It's super interesting. So now we're going to talk about the crucial importance of the messenger. And Luke, can you play that video? Oh, let me just set it up. So Kara Pike started and runs an organization called Reclimate, which is affiliated with Carleton University, which is trying to be the Yale Climate Center for Canada. And I see you. And she's interviewing for a Reclimate webinar. They run these fabulous webinars. They're free. You just have to get on the newsletter. And so she's interviewing Larissa, who's the climate leader, about this particular topic. So that's how we're doing. Now, just a second question. No, that's just an example of an effective message if you're worried about a data center stealing all the energy from the town. Keep the lights on. So, right, so the question is, how is keep the lights on a climate message? Usually I'd turn this over to the group and have you solve that problem. They were trying to persuade the government to regulate data centers so that they drew less energy. And because data centers are a really big energy draw in Ireland, thankfully in British Columbia, this government has stopped that from happening, at least in part, by declining permits, for example, for Bitcoin, which uses up a lot of energy. So if you're going to spend all your energy servicing data centers, then you're not going to have enough energy for your town unless you bring in fracked gas, which is the current plan of the Irish government. All right, so thanks for that.
Slogan, it will hurt the people you love. Huge prediction, it hurts the people you love.
Yep.
Present tense.
Good idea. Yep. Good idea. It hurts the people you love. Yep. Rather than having the aliens say, you've got this pollution blanket, it will hurt the people that you love. It is hurting the people that you love, right? So, okay, just by the way, we're not going to have a lot of Q&A in person in the group because it excludes the Zoom participants. Instead, at the end of each session, we're going to have an opportunity for you to put your questions up on Mentimeter, and then people can vote them up. So we'll see. So hopefully that will be a way for you to interact that levels the playing field. It's always a challenge when you have a big Zoom group. All right, so let's meet Larissa Crawford.
Larissa, there's an ongoing and growing conversation that climate change and social equity cannot be separated. Your business focuses on organizational and personal change work needed to ensure there is a deep commitment to and practice of anti-racism. Can you tell us more what it means to you to integrate climate and social equity work?
Merci, Kia Matin, Larissa Crawford de Chanel Caution. Bonjour, bon matin, je m'appelle Larissa Crawford. Hello, good morning, my name is Larissa Crawford, and I'm really excited to be joining everyone today. And so, yeah, I love this question, and I think I'll speak a little bit to how I understand climate action. And this is something that many people have heard before, that climate action cannot be equitable and sustainable without climate justice. So that means the physical consequences of environment and climate change cannot be removed from the social and political implications and causes. So to me, climate justice means that climate action done on the globe's Indigenous lands must center Indigenous peoples, knowledge systems, and sovereignty, and the lived experiences of and barriers to a lot of equity-seeking groups. So this is how I understand climate justice. And I think that one of those first steps for any of us doing our work on Indigenous lands is to first understand what that means. It's to understand the responsibilities that we carry as many of us are guests on those lands. And I find that in doing this work and in understanding my commitment to this work, and in integrating climate and social equity work, a lens through which I enjoy doing this, in which I find a lot of power in doing this, is through the lens of ancestry. So an understanding that we're all future ancestors, and we all really play a part in shaping the future the next generations will inherit. So to me, this means when I look at my daughter, I see our future generations personified. I see our ancestors personified. When I look at the land, same thing. I see our future generations and our ancestors personified. To me, being a future ancestor really means seeking to connect with our ancestors to understand the consequences of their actions and inactions. So understanding history, understanding our personal ancestors and what they did, but also understanding the ancestors of the original caregivers, the ancestors who established the systems that we've inherited and continue in many parts to maintain. And it also means actively allowing that insight to inform one's personal actions and understanding that our actions and inactions will have consequences on our future generations. so I think that leveraging these teachings, especially Indigenous teachings, oftentimes wherever you go in the world, Indigenous communities are going to hold teachings about ancestry and a lot of their traditional knowledge. And allowing this to frame our way of being provides us with a narrative by which we can understand ourselves as being accountable to the actions and inactions, the faults and resiliency of our ancestors, while also finding that collective power in our agency to act with impact as future ancestors. So I've gathered a lot of my teachings from Métis, Anishinaabe, Cree, and Blackfoot elders and teachings. But again, you're seeing these kind of teachings around the world, and I see a lot of power when I'm in Alberta, I'm in Calgary. When I go into sometimes very tense situations where I'm doing an anti-racism training in the energy sector in a very white dominant group and organization, where there's a lot of resistance or hesitation or anxiety around talking about what we're seeing now with a need to respond to racial inequities. And when we start talking about ancestry, when we start doing that authentic work of understanding where we come from and understanding, again, the ancestors of the space in which we occupy, we're better able to start positioning ourselves within that work. And then really quickly, my personal journey in understanding that my Métis ancestors owned Mohawk slaves and that I carry a slave master named Crawford. When I started to really reflect on what that meant and the impacts that state-sanctioned trauma have had on my ancestral lines, have had on my father, my grandfather, through residential schooling, through slave, from practices from the slave trade that have impacted Jamaican communities and continue to this day. When I started understanding that history of what's happened to my ancestors, I'm better able to understand why I experienced some of the things I experience now. But I also understand a more personal commitment to this work. And I think we create space in professional spaces to really talk about that and think about that and let that influence our work, we get to really interesting places. And so I'll stop there, but that would be my initial point when we're doing this climate and social equity work, to not lose sight of the people we're talking about and the people who've created these systems and what we're doing to change that for the ones that.
Thank you. There we go. So to switch gears into a different kind of typology, there's a group in the UK called ACT Climate, ACT Climate, Action Lab, and they have divided people up into the convinced and the alienated and the persuadables. They've got a bunch of categories. And this is a young woman who works with them talking about how to engage the persuadables. Luke, did you want to say any more about that? Okay. So do you want to just play that clip? This is a little bit tricky. We haven't figured out the tech so smoothly for podcasts.
He's sticking now being realistic. So they are struggling.
We're starting just in a small section of it.
28, yeah.
This is a brilliant podcast.
Recommend.
More likely to be engaged and understand the actual impacts of what we're saying when it's related to their communities and their livelihoods. Linked to being realistic, I think there is a great opportunity of thinking about portraying solutions as common sense, because, as I said before, most people don't identify as activists, and they're not going to do anything that really makes them stand out or that puts them in a position where they can be seen as like trying to be better than others. And so showcasing adaptation as easy and portraying engaging in climate solutions as, of course, it's common sense. Why wouldn't you? Just takes out a lot of drama from engaging in sustainable behaviors and just makes it normal. And I would say that for our audience who's might be based in the UK, the third element would be really focusing on British values, because community is a source of support, of empathy, of unity, and there is a lot that we can showcase in terms of that community aspect in our communications. British culture is fun and it's witty, and it has a ton of metaphors and anecdotes and references and big iconic moments that people will resonate with. And so making more use of that popular culture element will bring people in. But we also need to understand that a lot of people are afraid of change, and a big part of persuadables hold their cultural traditions very closely to their hearts. And so it's important to respect those traditions while also advocating for change, because those traditions mean a lot to people.
Do you think that that's transferable to other national contexts?
Yes, it goes down to what unites people and what is the social fabric of the country. We have heard that a lot of persuadables think that people talking about climate issues are others, and they are, people not like me. And so I think we have a lot to win by showcasing that our solutions and our initiatives can be part of the social fabric of the country and add value to what we hold dear in society. So there is also an opportunity there.
What's the single most important aspect of communication that we should be paying attention to in our communications endeavors?
I would say, going back to some of the issues I mentioned, we have a lot to learn from advertising. There is a power in reaching people many, many times with the same message. Advertising has the power to raise the profile of our social causes. It can make people more interested in the things that we are campaigning for. It can also engage people to take action. And using advertising for our purposes can be incredibly powerful. Thinking about the way in which we are influenced by communications and using that to the advantage so that they serve the purposes of climate messages, it's a huge untapped opportunity.
Conversely, what's the biggest mistake that you see communicators make when attempting to engage the public on climate change issues?
I would say assuming that everyone is in the same mindset that you are. And so I think we are lucky enough to be working in organizations where we feel the collective power of all of us working towards, our organization's mission and our key messages. But outside that building or that company or your home, people don't feel the same level of urgency, and they are not really as engaged as we are. And I think it's important that we constantly remind ourselves that people are in different steps of the journey when it comes to not aware to interested to engaged in that journey of our engagement with climate change. We are very, very engaged, and not everyone is.